So it's about 3 days to go to the elections, I think. And let's be honest, we're all a little bit nervous about what things are going to look like on the other side of the elections. Over the last few years, we've had a bit of a roller coaster ride, especially here in KZN. We've had to deal with recessions, shrinking economies, COVID, fear of death, loss of income as a result of that. We've had flood after flood after flood after flood, riots literally down the road, round the corner, more shrinking economies. And now we're about to go into an election that's probably the least predictable that we've ever had. So I mean, who here is maybe just a little bit fearful? It's going to get much worse by the time we. Um, but who here lies awake at night worrying about your financial future, maybe your exams, your retirement, your children? You wonder, maybe that feeling in your chest is the first signs of a heart attack, or that weird little mole on your arm is cancer. I mean, uh, who here that lets your fear overwhelm you at times? You don't have to say it out loud. I mean, I think we all fear from time to time. But the problem with a life of fear is that it robs us of our future. When we're too worried about today's bread, we don't plant the seeds of tomorrow. And I know that firsthand myself. John Wimber once said, he said, faith is spelt R-I-S-K. And when we choose to accept and stay in our fear, we never risk. We never get to see what's on the other side of the hill. We never get to see the incredible things that God has for us. We never get out of the boat and experience the amazing thing of walking with Jesus on the water. There was a book I read years ago called A Life Without Lack by a guy by the name of Dallas Willard, who is probably one of the most profound Christian thinkers of our time. And the sort of the first line in that book, it starts off saying, "The world is a perfectly good and safe place to be." And I mean, just think about that for a second. Like that actually seems delusional. I mean, if you think about it, the world is a perfectly good and safe place to be. That doesn't sound right. But the book goes on to say, he says, 26 years ago, I was introduced to the possibility of a life in which I was never in need of anything at any time from anyone. A life that knows no fear or fluster, no anxiety or angst, no perturbation of any sort. It was, in short, the offer of a life without lack. And this is actually an echo of Paul's words in Philippians 4:11. I've learned to be content in all circumstances. I mean, who doesn't want? I mean, who doesn't want that for your life? Like that's what I want. But I can see there's a difference between what I want and my reality. So what do we do with that? What do we do with our fear in this fear-inducing world? How do we live in that space that both Dallas Willard and Paul describe? Well, there's this young man in Germany by the name of Stefan Betz, and he's been in and out of hospital his whole life. And actually, initially, his parents thought he was mentally impaired. He was so clumsy, he kept bumping into things. And after he'd actually bitten the tip of his tongue off again and ended up in hospital again, the doctors there diagnosed him with something called congenital analgesia, which is like a fancy word for the inability to feel pain. And Stefan has actually fared fairly well compared to most people with this condition, who tend to die with fairly innocuous injuries, ranging from like tooth infections to broken bones, and actually many of them actually end up taking their lives at the prospect of living in wheelchairs. And he's actually done fairly well. But it's all because they can't feel any pain. And for the majority of us, on the other hand, we We see pain as a handicap or an inconvenience or maybe even a punishment. Popping pills at the first sign of a headache. We ask, why would God be so cruel? And I've heard of people rejecting God for the idea of pain, like the fact that there's pain in this world, they reject an idea that there could be a God based on that. But few of us see pain as a gift. But Stefan Betz himself said, people assume that feeling no pain is this incredible thing, and it almost makes you superhuman. But for people with congenital analgesia, it's the exact opposite. We would love to know what pain means and what it feels like to be in pain. Without it, your life is full of challenges. So let me say something that on first hearing sounds completely wrong. Pain is good. It's God's gift to us because it shows us where danger is and what can harm us or hurt us. It actually keeps us alive. And today, I want to show you how fear, just like pain, is good. Fear, like pain, is God's gift to us. And I hope that's jarring to hear, that maybe it's a little bit unsettling for you. And it should be, because it's true, but it's not the whole truth. It's not the whole picture. And this is not something I've always believed myself. Up until a few years ago, I believed that fear was wrong, like to be fearful was wrong, and maybe even sinful to be in fear. But fear is God's gift to us. But let me make this perfectly clear. Just as God doesn't want us to feel pain, He doesn't want us to be experiencing pain. He doesn't want us to have to feel fear or to be afraid. But He gave it to us as a necessary protection mechanism. He doesn't want us to feel fear. It's not His best for us. He doesn't want us lying awake at 3 a.m. I mean, who's woken up at 3 a.m. with this like deep anxiety? He doesn't want that for us. He doesn't want us to be constantly feeling that low-grade anxiety over our children or our parents or our future. But fear is His gift to us, a gift that tells us that something's wrong. To get a good idea of what God's ideal for us is, let's go back to Eden. It's always a great place to start. In Eden, it's this amazing place that God created for Adam and Eve, and he said, "Go ahead, like I've made this wonderful garden. Eat anything from the abundance of this amazing place. Just this one tree, just this one tree. Just stay away from that one. You really don't want to eat from that tree." But then they chose to ignore God's words to them. And whether it was a physical tree that they ate the fruit of, or it was a symbolic turning away from an utter dependence on God, either way, their action resulted in them experiencing fear and pain and shame for the first time, because up until that point, they had always known that God was looking after them. They now had the knowledge of good and evil. I just want to shift gears for a moment just to kind of give you another sort of analogy of this, and excuse the pun, but car manufacturers have learned a thing or two in the last 120 years, especially when it comes to safety. I remember when seatbelts weren't actually standard in cars. Yes, I am that old, Godswill. But I mean, come on, it was actually only the 80s. It was like only the other day, really. It feels like that. But cars have come a long way since then. They now have these things called crumple zones built into them. And what the crumple zones do is, in the case of an extreme impact, they'll actually absorb all of that pressure, crumple up, and they protect their passengers from all of that destructive energy. And the car is destroyed in the process, but the passengers get to step out of the car alive. And the consequences of Adam and Eve's act was death, as God said it would be. But the death was a separation from God, which is actually the worst kind of death, but we don't see it that way necessarily. But God, in His goodness and His mercy, had built into them, into us, these crumple zones, hoping that they would never have to be used. But if they had to, they would save our lives. And two of those crumple zones are pain and fear. And again, I just want to reiterate that the crumple zones of pain and fear they're not what God wants for us, but they help us step out of the wreck of the mistakes and the chaos of our everyday lives. Just like He doesn't want us driving car wrecks because they're not safe, they've got all these sharp edges. He doesn't want us to actually stay in our fear. He wants us to learn from our fear and make the necessary changes. Otherwise, we just end up hurting ourselves and other people around us. But in God's mercy, He gave us these tools to know that there's something wrong, either morally or physically or relationally. And this next bit is the key to everything I'm saying this morning. Pain and fear are the warning signs that tell us the truth that we are weak, we're frail, and we're limited. They're the warning signs back to the deepest truth that there is, that we absolutely, thoroughly need God. And not just need God, we need to depend on God. But the sin part of us resists that to the death. We want independence. We don't want to know how much we need God. We don't want to be accountable. And that's honestly at the heart of what sin actually is. That's the heart of what sin is. But we need to know in the deepest part of who we are, the truth that God is good and that we desperately, desperately need Him. You see, the antidote to fear is always truth. On the path back to health and wholeness, when we're confronted by fear, we repeatedly face two choices. At every point, truth, that we need God, or delusion that we are enough, that we are self-sufficient. And so ultimately, fear is exactly that. It's a clearer understanding of our weakness. Fear is good because it gives us a more accurate picture of the world. The world is a dangerous place. I mean, read or watch the news. Well, actually, who am I kidding? We don't get our news from normal news sources these days. We get it from Facebook or TikTok. What could possibly go wrong with that? But the world is portrayed as this terrible place full of murder, of rape, abductions, bank foreclosures, poverty, divorce, death. I told you it was going to get bad. And even Jesus said, in this life, you'll have trouble. Jesus said that. But fear is seeing ourselves in that context, seeing how small and insignificant we are in the face of disease and famine and death and all of these terrible things. I realize I know I'm probably making everyone a little bit more fearful. We need to push through that. Just to hold on to your seats for a little while. But fear is interesting because fear brings both truth, what we've been speaking about, and motivation. You could say in a way that fear is a force for truth. And like any force, we can either let it act on us or we can resist it. And it's really important. It brings both truth and motivation. As an example, let's use snakes. I mean, who here is afraid of snakes? I mean, I'm pretty petrified of snakes. But when you're standing in front of a green mamba, it brings both that fear brings both truth and motivation. The truth is that if you get bitten, you're going to die. And the motivation makes you run away as fast as you possibly can. And you see, not only is fear an uncovering of the truth, not only is it us seeing ourselves for the truth of who we are, of what we are, it's also a driver, a motivation or a push. Now that we have a more accurate picture of the world around us, fear provides a motivation to do something about it. It elicits a response in us. And the choice that we usually make is either fight or flight. So flight is doing nothing about it. We run away. We put our heads in the sand. We procrastinate. We ignore the problem. Fight is obviously put up our fists and we stand and we gather our resources, we plan, we make lists, we fix the problem. And I want to say, obviously, there's nothing wrong with either of those approaches, and there's nothing wrong. They're natural ways to approach things. And sometimes when you're standing in front of a green mamba, the wise choice is to run for your life. And sometimes when you're faced with something, it's good to stand and deal with it. And sometimes you can just do what Michelle did, where she had just been shopping, and this mugger came up to her, and he sort of sidled up to her, and he had a knife, and he showed her his knife, and she sort of looked at the knife, and she thought, oh well, she was carrying some apples, and she thought, well, maybe he wants some apples, and she was like, oh yeah, okay, but she was in a rush, so she was like, oh, sorry, not today. Maybe tomorrow. I'll come back tomorrow. And she walked off. And the mugger was like, what just happened there? So sometimes a little bit of naivety is probably a helpful thing from time to time. So fight or flight in themselves, they're not wrong in themselves. But almost always, either of those responses most times are flawed because they come from a place of denying the truth. They come from delusion. Because most times when we apply them, they're coming from a place of independence, independence from God. Don't worry, God, I've got this. I can sort this out. Self-reliance, me do me own self, as my kids might say. Fear is a sign that we understand the world and we see our place in it more clearly. But when we're confronted by fear, the important choice isn't between fight or flight. It's between self-reliance or dependence on God. We need to learn to take the first step away from the delusions of grandeur that we are all-powerful, all-knowing, that we are God. It seems like a strange thing to say, but that's actually how we live our lives. And remember, I said that the antidote to fear is truth. It's always truth. And it's at this point, right when we're confronted by something that's fear-making, that things usually go wrong. It's at this point that we usually choose to be delusional. Either we build our Babel towers as a monument to our strength and ingenuity. We look for ways to cut God out of the picture, to minimize our reliance on Him. And we look in all kinds of places. We look to science, we look to religion, we look to money, to technology, to power, all of those places, anything but having to acknowledge the truth of our weakness, anything but to depend on and be accountable to God. Or we can bravely let fear take us on that path of truth, acknowledge our weakness, our frailty, our limitations, that we have finite money, energy, and time, that we need help. We need to let fear spur us on to look for that help. And sometimes we find help in each other. So sometimes we find help in our families, in our communities, in our governments, all great places to seek help because we do need each other. But all of those only give us a measure of help. All of them, at the end of the day, all of those things can't actually take away our fear. They can't actually ultimately take away our fear entirely. And I'm not talking here as someone who's overcome fear. I haven't got this all figured out. Fear is something I've struggled with my whole life. I had this debilitating fear of the dark as a kid. I mean, it was just ridiculous. I was afraid of heights, afraid of monsters. I thought there were monsters under my bed, like probably every kid. I was utterly afraid of public speaking. There's no chance I would ever have been doing this. I wrestled with OCD as a teenager. My family, we used to do target shooting, and every Saturday we'd go to the shooting range, and at the end of the shoot, my parents there'd be a lot of drinking going on. And when I was older, I sort of decided not to go, and I'd stay at home on the Saturday, and I was utterly convinced that I was going to get a phone call from somebody to say, your parents have been in a horrific car crash. It was this horrible fear that I had. My gran and my dad died of cancer on the same day. My mother died of cancer a few years later. So that I thought I would be next. I didn't think I'd reach the age of 30, honestly. And then getting married and having kids got so much more to lose. Like I was so afraid that something might happen to my family. And anybody who runs their own business know that, I mean, running a business is a fear-inducing machine. You're always afraid that you're never going to have enough. I mean, the end of the month is coming up. We're 26th of May. End of the month is coming up. That pain is feeling. Am I going to be able to pay my staff? That's a constant. I mean, I lie awake at night, worrying about whether Michelle and I will ever be able to retire. Like the fear is no stranger to me. I don't want to leave you with any illusions here. But do you know that in some places around the world, people resort to people with a worse environmental sort of legislation. They deal with their rubbish by just digging these big pits, just shoveling all of their rubbish into those pits, and then they just cover it over with sand. And the idea is out of sight, out of mind. But the truth is that even unseen, our rubbish is actually poisoning the groundwater, causing all kinds of sicknesses and diseases. And so often we don't see the underlying cause. We don't see the link between our rubbish and our sickness. But sometimes, if we're lucky, as time goes on, the ground is affected by extreme changes in temperature, and the earth actually pushes this rubbish up out of the ground, exposing our past stupidity, forcing us to actually deal with it properly. And if you want a good analogy for a midlife crisis, that's actually it. Faced with the fear of death, all our rubbish starts to work its way up to the surface, except that then we go out and buy a Harley Davidson or something like that. But this is so often what we do with our fears. So often we respond to fear by burying it. We push it down. We tell ourselves that we shouldn't be fearful. We hide from the thoughts and the emotions that come with fear, preferring not to dredge up the pain that's been inflicted on us by others or the trauma from the past. But the problem is, just like those pits, when fear isn't confronted, it finds a way to make itself known. It rears its head in different ways, in depression, in anger, OCD, other control issues. And we see those as the enemy, as diseases without a cause. But here's the amazing truth. Those are also gifts from God. They're pointing us towards something that lies buried within ourselves. We can't bury our stuff without consequences. That's a delusion. God wants us to always be moving from delusion to truth, always. That's what He wants. So when we see signs of psychological imbalance in our lives, maybe an obsessive need to control others or the world around us, or an anger that bubbles up uncontrollably to the surface, or spiraling feelings of depression, these are all signs that we need to deal with something that's buried deep within ourselves. When you see signs of OCD, it's actually a spectrum. It's not just one thing. It's a spectrum from a need to like constantly straighten everything on our desks on the sort of lower end of and washing your hands. Sometimes you end up on the other side. It's washing your hands until they bleed, counting and checking the doors are closed, and checking and rechecking on the other end of it. That's an outward sign that you're needing to bring order to the chaos that's on the outside. You're finding a way to bring order to the chaos. or when your emotions take control of you rather than the other way around. When something makes you so angry that you just can't control yourself, it's a sign that something's buried deep inside. And the crumple zones are releasing some of that destructive energy just to keep you safe. All around us, depression is on the rise, and it's getting younger and younger. Hashtag screens and devices. I had to throw that one in there. Ultimately, depression is a resignation to the fact that we can't address our fears satisfactorily. Our solution to depression is just to self-medicate with pills, but just to leave the ultimate questions unaddressed. And I'm definitely not saying we shouldn't take antidepressants. They're life-saving in many cases, especially if there's a physiological imbalance. But medication is there to bring clarity to our thinking so we can start to see and deal with the truth. Because remember, the antidote to fear is always truth. So the best place to start is to go back to the truth. God's word to us is interesting. You know that the most repeated command in the Bible is fear not. But they're never an admonishment. I always felt like they were an admonishment. Oh, don't be afraid. Like, they're not the angry words of a distant God. They're words of encouragement from a God that himself was so anxious that he sweated drops of blood at the prospect of being separated from the Father. The words fear not are an encouragement by the Father to get an even more accurate picture of the world. Because also dotted throughout the Bible are the words, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. And those words are the ultimate place to start. Because, and here's the crux, here's the truth. Fear can't be reasoned fully away. Anyone who's tried to talk themselves out of fear or tried to talk somebody else out of fear, I mean, I've tried to convince Matt there's nothing wrong with going up in an airplane. I've tried to convince Godswill not to be afraid of geckos. I'm still working on him with that one. But fear can't be reasoned away. It can only be displaced. It was interesting to me that in the middle of COVID, in the middle of the fear that most people were feeling with COVID, we had the riots. And I was watching this in real time, paying attention to this, and it was amazing. Like, the fear of COVID went out the window. Nobody was afraid of COVID anymore because the fear of somebody rocking up on your doorstep was so much more real and big. Fear can only be displaced. And ultimately, fear can only be displaced by God himself. If the fear we're experiencing is crippling us, is robbing us, it's because we've stopped short in our reality check. We're overwhelmed by what we can't control, that's good, our inabilities and our weaknesses, but we've stopped just short of the fear of God. And the only antidote to the fear of death and pain that the world throws at us is to displace the fear with the wonder, awe, and reverence of a good God whose words remain true for eternity and regardless of the circumstances, and who's promised to be with us whatever we may face, and not only to be with us whatever we may face, but to turn whatever we may face into our ultimate good. I mean, if we let those words sink in, how can we be afraid, knowing who God is? What kind of an amazing promise is that? Every one of my fears, God has an answer for. God is an answer for. Fear of not having enough money, God has time and time again reminded me that he has never and never will let me down. Fear of something happening to my family, God reminds me that he loves my family even more than I do. fear of cancer or death. That's probably been the one that's really I've struggled with the most. But God reminds me that to live is Christ, but to die is gain. Death, where is your victory? Where is your sting? And these are all fears that I struggle with on a daily basis. But I've had a measure of victory over these fears because of who I've experienced God to be over the last 20-something years. And my biggest fear now is kind of this sort of meta fear that I'm going to let fear rob me of the life that God has for me. And my biggest fear is that one day I'm going to stand before him and he's going to say, well done, good and faithful servant. But you had so much more. Yeah, I had so much more for you, but you just didn't take those risks. You didn't step out of the boat, walk on the water with Jesus. That honestly, that is my biggest fear. I really don't want that to be the sort of legacy of my life. At the end of the day, everything is about our priorities. The seeking, finding that plot of land with the pearl of great price, buying that, seeking God and his kingdom first, loving God with everything. You can see what your priorities are by what you spend your life on. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So where is our treasure? If it's not God, I can guarantee you we will end up afraid. I can guarantee you. Jesus' fear in the garden was so intense that he actually bled through his pores. And it's a real physical condition called hematidrosis. And what happens is, in cases of extreme physical or emotional stress, the blood vessels below the surface constrict to the point of forcing blood up through the pores. But the interesting thing is that for Jesus, it wasn't the prospect of pain or death by crucifixion, which if you read up about it, it's an incredibly painful way to die. For Jesus, it wasn't the fear of pain and death. It was the prospect of being separated from the Father that caused him so much anxiety. And yet we are so content in our separation, our daily separation from the Father. What did Jesus know that we don't? I think our picture of truth, of reality, is so very skewed. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Fear is good when it leads us to the truth. If we stop anywhere short of Jesus, our fear will make itself known. So where is fear making itself known in your life? And what are you going to do about it? Let's take those fears and fix our eyes on him who is called provision, whose name is safety, who is the healer, who is the comforter, whose character is goodness. And the fears of this world will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and his grace. So let's stand. Let's invite the Holy Spirit to come and speak to us.